The smoke from the Trinity Alps had been visible for 3 days before anyone in the valley started to worry. That was how it always went in Northern California. Fire season had become fire year, and people had learned to live with the haze the way their grandparents had learned to live with fog. Maya Reeves stood at the edge of the excavation she had been digging for 8 months, her hands wrapped around a shovel handle worn smooth by constant use, and watched the smoke gather like a bruise against the eastern sky. Her dog, a blue heeler named Ash, sat at the rim of the pit, his ears forward, his body tense with an awareness that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with instinct. The hole was 12 feet deep now, 24 feet long, 16 feet wide. The dimensions of a modest cabin. If that cabin were meant to exist beneath the surface of the earth rather than on top of it. The walls were shored with timber she had cut and milled herself. The floor level with a precision that would have impressed the engineers she used to work with before the fire that took everything. Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story is touching you already, make sure you're subscribed. I've got something extra special saved for tomorrow. That fire had been 5 years ago. The campfire, they called it, though there was nothing camp-like about the inferno that had swallowed paradise in a matter of hours. Maya had been a structural engineer for a development company, designing homes that met every building code, every safety standard, every requirement the state demanded. She had watched those homes burn like kindling, watched families she knew die in cars on roads that became corridors of flame, watched her own apartment complex, rated for fire resistance, collapse into ash while she ran through smoke so thick she couldn't see her own hands. She had survived because she was young and fast, and because the wind had shifted at exactly the right moment. 85 people hadn't been as lucky. The number haunted her more than the scars on her arms where embers had landed and burned through her jacket. After Paradise, she couldn't design another above-ground home. Couldn't sit in another meeting where developers talked about acceptable risk and profit margins. Couldn't pretend that building to code was the same as building to survive. So she had walked away. From the job, from the city, from the life that felt like a lie she had been telling herself about safety and permanence, an illusion that walls and roofs could protect you from what was coming. She had taken her savings and bought 40 acres in the Sierra foothills, land that nobody wanted because it was too steep, too remote, too far from power lines and paved roads. Land that came with a seasonal creek, a stand of ponderosa pines, and a soil composition that was 70% decomposed granite, which meant it could be excavated with hand tools if you had enough time and stubbornness. Maya had both. The neighbors thought she was building a root cellar. That was what she had told the county when she filed for the permit, because trying to explain what she was actually building would have triggered reviews and inspections and questions she didn't have the energy to answer. A root cellar was simple. A hole in the ground with a door. Nobody cared about root cellars. What she was actually building was a home. An underground home with walls thick enough to withstand radiant heat that could melt steel. A home with ventilation systems that could be sealed against smoke. A home with its own water source, its own power generation, its own systems for survival when the world above became uninhabitable. The neighbors had started calling her the Mole Woman 3 months into the excavation. She heard her at the general store in Weaverville when she came down the mountain for supplies. Heard again at the hardware shop, where she bought lumber and concrete mix and the specialized ventilation components that cost more than she wanted to spend but were worth every dollar. The Mole Woman, the crazy engineer who lost her mind in Paradise and thought she could hide from fire by digging a hole. They weren't entirely wrong. She had lost something in Paradise. Maybe it was her mind. Maybe it was just the part of her mind that believed in the permanence of anything built on the surface. But she wasn't hiding. She was adapting. Tom Hendricks, who owned the cattle ranch 2 miles down the mountain, had stopped by in July while she was hauling dirt. He was a third-generation rancher, weathered and certain, the kind of man who had opinions about everything and the confidence to share them whether you asked or not. "That's a hell of a hole," he had said, standing at the rim and looking down at her like she was curiosity. "What are you planning to store down there?" "Nuclear waste." "Food," Maya had replied, not looking up from the wheelbarrow she was loading. "Water. The usual. Seems like a lot of work for a root cellar." "It's a big root cellar." He had laughed, but it wasn't a kind laugh. You know what they're saying in town, right? That you're building a bunker. that you think the end of the world is coming. Maya had stopped then, straightened, met his eyes. The end of my world already came, Tom. I'm just making sure it doesn't come twice. He hadn't known what to say to that. He had nodded and walked back to his truck and driven away, and she had returned to her digging. The excavation had taken all spring and most of summer. Maya worked alone except for Ash, who spent his days patrolling the perimeter and his nights pressed against her in the tent she had pitched under the pines. She dug in the early mornings before the heat became unbearable, and again in the evenings when the temperature dropped and the light turned gold across the granite slopes. She hauled dirt in a wheelbarrow, one load at a time, spreading it in low berms around the excavation site. The berms would serve a purpose later: windbreaks, fire breaks, visual barriers that would help disguise what she had built. But for now, they were just piles of earth, evidence of her labor, monuments to the stubbornness that her mother had always said would either save her or destroy her. The walls went up in sections. Maya poured concrete footings and laid cinder block, filling the cores with rebar and concrete to create a structure that could bear the weight of the earth above and the lateral pressure from the soil on all sides. She worked from plans she had drawn herself, calculations she had run and rerun until she was certain they would hold. The engineering was simple, really. Concrete was stronger in compression than tension. Underground structures bore compressive loads almost exclusively. The earth itself provided insulation, thermal mass, and protection from radiant heat. A properly designed underground shelter could maintain habitable temperatures even when the air above reached 2,000 degrees. She knew the numbers. She had seen what 2,000 degrees did to conventional structures. She had watched houses with fire-resistant siding and dual-pane windows and composition roofs, rated for Class A fire resistance, turn into puddles of melted plastic and twisted metal. She wasn't going to build that way again. By August, the walls were complete, and she had started on the roof system. This was the most critical part, the element that would determine whether her home was a shelter or a tomb. The roof had to bear the weight of 18 inches of soil. It had to be waterproof, fireproof, and strong enough to support her if she needed to stand on the surface during an evacuation. She used steel I-beams spanning the width of the structure, set at 16-inch intervals, and bolted into the concrete walls. Over the beams, she laid a deck of pressure-treated plywood, then a layer of rubberized roofing membrane, then rigid foam insulation, then another membrane, and finally a drainage layer that would direct water away from the living space below. The work was slow and precise. Every beam had to be level. Every bolt had to be torqued to specification. Every seam in the membrane had to be sealed and tested. She worked in the September heat while the smoke from distant fires turned the sun into a copper disk, and the air took on the acrid smell that meant somewhere something was burning. The neighbors kept watching. She saw their trucks slow on the dirt road that passed a quarter mile from her property. Saw them stop sometimes, sitting in their cabs with their engines running, staring at the mound of earth and the steel beams rising from the pit like the ribs of some buried creature. Nobody came to help. Nobody offered advice or tools, or even words of encouragement. They just watched and judged and drove on. Maya didn't care. She had stopped caring what people thought somewhere between the third and fourth month of excavation, somewhere between the 100th and 1,000th wheelbarrow load of dirt. She cared about one thing, building something that would stand when everything else fell. The soil went on in October, just as the first rains arrived. Maya spread 18 inches of native soil over the roof membrane, grading it carefully to shed water toward the drainage swales she had cut into the hillside. Over the soil she laid erosion cloth and scattered native grass seed that would germinate with the winter rains and create a living roof that would be indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape by spring. From the road, you wouldn't even know the structure existed. Just another fold in the hillside, another slope covered in the golden grass that turned the foothills into a patchwork of amber and green. That was intentional. Maya had learned in paradise that visibility meant vulnerability. The houses that burned first were the ones that stood out, the ones with shake roofs and with siding and landscaping that created fuel ladders straight to the eaves. The houses that had any chance at all were the ones that blended in, that didn't give the fire anything to grab onto. Her underground home gave the fire nothing. No eaves, no roof, no siding, no windows to shatter and allow embers inside. Just earth and grass in the mouth of a ventilation pipe that could be sealed in seconds. The entrance was the final piece, and the most complex. Maya had designed it as an airlock system, 2 doors separated by a 4-foot vestibule. The outer door was steel, recessed into the hillside and hidden behind a natural rock outcropping. She had been careful not to disturb during excavation. The inner door was also steel, but lighter, easier to operate from inside. Between the doors, she installed a ventilation system with filters rated for wildfire smoke. The system could pull in fresh air when conditions were safe and seal completely when they weren't. She had tested it with smoke from her own campfires, measuring particulate levels inside the shelter while burning green. Would that produce a thick, choking smoke similar to wildfire conditions? The system worked. Inside, the air remained clear even when the smoke outside was thick enough to sting her eyes. She moved into the shelter in late October, carrying her belongings down the stairs she had poured in concrete and carved with tread grooves for traction. A cot, a camp stove, a water filtration system, her books and tools, and the few photographs she had saved from paradise. Ash followed, his nails clicking on the concrete, his body relaxed in the cool underground space. The temperature inside was a constant 58 degrees, regardless of what the thermometer read on the surface. Cool in summer, warm in winter, moderated by the thermal mass of the earth that surrounded them on all sides. Maya had installed a small propane heater for the coldest months and a dehumidifier to prevent moisture buildup, but most of the time she didn't need either. The shelter felt safe in a way nothing had felt safe since paradise. The walls were solid. The ceiling was strong. The air was clean. And when she lay on her cot at night with Ash's weight warm against her legs, she could almost believe that she had built something that would last. The first real test came on a November morning, when the wind shifted. Maya was outside, working on the final details of the ventilation system, when Ash's behavior changed. He went rigid, his ears pinned back, his eyes fixed on the eastern horizon where the smoke had been gathering for days. She followed his gaze and felt something cold settle in her stomach. The smoke wasn't gathering anymore. It was moving, a wall of gray-black cloud rolling toward them like a living thing. Pushed by wind she could already feel picking up, carrying the smell that every Californian had learned to recognize. Burning pine, burning oak, burning homes. The fire had jumped the containment lines. Maya's phone buzzed in her pocket. An evacuation warning for her area. Residents should prepare to leave immediately. The fire was moving at unprecedented speed, pushed by winds gusting to 60 miles per hour. She looked at the shelter entrance, barely visible behind its rock outcropping. Then she looked at the dirt road that led down the mountain toward Highway 3, toward the valley, toward the evacuation routes that would already be clogged with vehicles and panic, and people who had waited too long. She had lived through one evacuation. She knew how it went. The roads became parking lots. The smoke became so thick you couldn't see the car in front of you. The heat became so intense that paint blistered and tires melted, and if you were very lucky, you made it through before the fire caught you from behind. If you weren't lucky, you died in your car, surrounded by other people dying in their cars, all of you trapped in a corridor of flame with nowhere to go. Maya wasn't going to die that way. She called Ash and headed for the entrance. The shelter door sealed with a sound that Maya felt more than heard, a soft hiss of rubber gaskets meeting steel frame. The metallic click of the locking mechanism engaging. She stood in the vestibule between the 2 doors, her heart hammering, her hands shaking as she activated the ventilation system's seal mode. Outside, through 6 inches of steel and 18 inches of earth, the world was ending again. Ash pressed against her legs, his body trembling. Dogs knew. They always knew. Maya knelt and wrapped her arms around him, pressing her face into his fur, breathing in the familiar smell of him, dust and pine needles and the faint chemical tang of the flea collar she had put on him last month. "We're okay," she whispered. "We're safe here." She wasn't sure if she was talking to the dog or to herself. The interior of the shelter was exactly 288 square feet, 12 feet by 24 feet, the same dimensions as a shipping container, which was what people built tiny houses from when they wanted to live. Small and mobile. But Maya's home wasn't mobile. It was anchored to the earth by concrete footings that went down 4 feet into bedrock. It wasn't going anywhere, and neither was she. She had divided the space carefully. A sleeping area with her cot, and a small dresser made from salvage pallets. A kitchen area with a 2-burner propane stove, a sink connected to a 500-gallon water tank buried even deeper than the shelter, and shelves stocked with enough rice and beans, and canned goods to last 6 months if she was careful. A bathroom, just a composting toilet behind a curtain, but it worked, and it was hers. The walls were lined with shelves that held her books, her tools, her seed collection for the garden she planned to plant in the spring. A small desk held her laptop and the solar battery system that kept it charged. The ceiling was fitted with LED strips that ran on 12-volt power from the solar panels she had installed on the south-facing slope above the shelter. It wasn't much, but it was everything. Maya checked her phone. The evacuation warning had escalated to an evacuation order. All residents in Zone 7 must leave immediately. The fire had crossed Bear Creek and was moving toward the ridge that separated her property from the Hendricks Ranch. She opened her weather app and felt her stomach drop. Wind gust to 70 miles per hour. Humidity at 8%. Red flag warning in effect. These were the conditions that turned fires into firestorms, that made flames jump highways and rivers, and fire breaks that were supposed to stop them. Her phone buzzed again. A text from a number she didn't recognize. "This is Tom Hendricks. You still up there? You need to evacuate now. Fire is moving fast." Maya stared at the message. Tom Hendricks, who had called her crazy. Tom Hendricks, who had laughed at her hole in the ground. Tom Hendricks, who was apparently worried enough to text her from an evacuation route he was probably already stuck on. She typed back, "I'm sheltering in place. I'm safe." The response came immediately. "You're insane. That fire will kill you. Get out. I know what I'm doing." She typed, "Stay safe." She turned off her phone to save battery and sat on her cot, listening. This was the part she hadn't been able to test. The part where she had to trust her engineering, her calculations, her understanding of heat transfer and combustion dynamics, and the way fire moved through landscape. She had built this shelter to withstand radiant heat of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. She had designed a ventilation system to seal completely against smoke and ash. She had buried herself deep enough that even if every tree on her property burned, even if the surface above her became a moonscape of char and ash, she would survive. In theory. Theory was different from practice. She had learned that in paradise. The first sound came 2 hours later. A roar, distant but growing closer, like a freight train accelerating toward her from the east. Ash lifted his head from his paws, his ears swiveling toward the sound. Maya stood and moved to the ventilation monitor she had installed near the entrance. The system had external sensors that measured air temperature, smoke particulate levels, and carbon monoxide. The readings were still normal. Outside temperature, 67 degrees. Smoke, minimal. 0. She checked the weather radar on her laptop. The fire's perimeter was marked in red, a jagged line that was advancing faster than the models had predicted. It had already consumed the timber between Bear Creek and Eagle Ridge. It was moving through the old growth along the North Fork, and it was heading straight toward her. The roar grew louder. Maya had heard that sound before. In paradise, running through streets where fire was creating its own weather system, where superheated air rose so fast it created winds that pulled in more oxygen, that fed the flames until they were hot enough to melt car engines and vaporize anything that couldn't withstand the heat. She had run from that sound. Now she was sitting beneath it, trusting 18 inches of earth and 6 inches of concrete to protect her from what was coming. Ash whined softly. Maya sat on the floor beside him and pulled him close. "I know," she said. "I hear it too." The roar became a scream. The temperature sensor spiked first. Maya watched the numbers climb on her monitor. 85 degrees. 110 degrees. 150 degrees. The fire was close now, close enough that the radiant heat was beginning to warm the soil above her shelter. 200 degrees. 300 degrees. 450 degrees. The LED strips flickered as the solar panels on the surface began to fail, their connections melting in heat that was beyond anything they were rated to withstand. Maya switched to battery power and checked her reserves. 12 hours at current consumption. Longer, she turned off everything except the air monitor and one light. She left one light on. Darkness was something she could handle. But not now. Not while the world above was burning. 550 degrees. 700 degrees. 900 degrees. Ash was panting now, his tongue lolling, his eyes wide. The shelter's interior temperature was rising too. 68 degrees, 72 degrees, 75 degrees. The thermal mass of the Earth was protecting them, absorbing the heat and releasing it slowly. But even thermal mass had limits. Maya did the calculations in her head. The shelter's walls were 8 inches of concrete. The ceiling was 6 inches of concrete, plus 18 inches of soil. Total R value of approximately R30, which meant for every degree the outside temperature rose, the inside would eventually rise by a proportional amount, but the lag time would be measured in hours. She had hours. The fire didn't need hours. It would pass in minutes, maybe less. 1,100 degrees. 1,400 degrees. 1,650 degrees. The roar overhead was constant now, a sound like standing inside a jet engine. Maya could feel it in her chest, a pressure that made breathing difficult even though the air in the shelter was clean and cool. Ash had stopped panting and was lying flat on the concrete floor, his body pressed against the coolest surface he could find. Maya joined him, lying on her stomach with her cheek against the floor, feeling the solid reality of it. Concrete poured by her own hands. Rebar she had cut and tied and placed according to specifications she had calculated on paper, because she didn't trust software to understand what she needed. The floor was cool. The floor was holding. 1,800 degrees. The sensor was reading the maximum heat that a structure fire could generate, the temperature at which aluminum melted, at which glass turned to liquid, at which human bodies carbonized so completely that dental records were the only way to identify them. Maya had seen bodies like that. In paradise. In the cars that hadn't made it out. In the homes of people who thought they could shelter in their bathtubs, who thought that 4 walls and a roof would be enough. It hadn't been enough. But this was different. This was 18 inches of earth between her and the fire. This was concrete and steel and engineering that understood the difference between surface and depth, between exposure and protection. This was going to work. It had to work. 2,000 degrees. The sensor hit its maximum reading and stopped climbing. Not because the fire had stopped burning, but because the sensor couldn't measure any higher. Maya stared at the number, her mind doing calculations she didn't want to do. At 2,000 degrees, steel began to lose structural integrity. At 2,000 degrees, the ventilation pipes running from her shelter to the surface would be glowing red. At 2,000 degrees, if there were any gaps in her waterproofing, any cracks in her concrete, any flaws in the system she had built, she would know about it soon. Very soon. The shelter's interior temperature had reached 82 degrees. Maya's shirt was soaked with sweat. Ash was panting again, his sides heaving. She got up and filled a bowl with water from the tank. Setting it in front of him, he drank without lifting his head, his tongue scooping water while his body stayed pressed to the floor. She checked the air monitor. Oxygen levels, normal. Carbon monoxide, 0. Particulates, 0. The ventilation system was sealed tight. Nothing was getting in, which meant she was breathing the air that was already here, and would continue breathing it until the fire passed, and she could unseal the vents and pull in fresh air from outside. She had calculated that she had 48 hours of air, maybe 60 if she stayed calm, if she didn't panic, if she didn't do anything stupid like hyperventilating. The fire wouldn't last 48 hours. It would pass in minutes. Maybe an hour if the fuel load was heavy, and the winds kept feeding it. She just had to wait. The roar began to fade. Maya didn't trust it at first. The fire in paradise had come in waves, pushed by winds that shifted and swirled, that brought flames from directions you didn't expect. She had seen fire jump a 4-lane highway and ignite homes on the opposite side, while the side it came from was still burning. But the temperature sensor was dropping. 1,950 degrees. 1,800 degrees. 1,600 degrees. The fire was moving past her, pushed by the same winds that had brought it here, moving west toward the valley where Tom Hendricks and everyone else had evacuated, where the roads were full and the shelters were filling, and people were praying that the fire wouldn't follow them down the mountain. Maya sat up slowly. Her head was pounding, her mouth dry. She drank water straight from the jug, not bothering with the cup, letting it spill down her chin. Ash had stopped panting. The interior temperature had stabilized at 84 degrees, hot but survivable. The sensor read 1,200 degrees, then 900, then 600. The fire was passing. She had survived. Maya waited 4 hours before unsealing the ventilation system. The temperature sensor read 150 degrees, still hot enough to burn skin, but cool enough that the landscape above was no longer actively burning, just smoldering, cooling, dying. She activated the intake fan slowly, watching the air quality monitor for any sign of smoke or carbon monoxide. The numbers stayed clean. The air coming in was hot and carried the smell of char, but it was breathable. She increased the fan speed and felt fresh air begin to circulate through the shelter. Ash lifted his head, his nostrils flaring, processing information she couldn't access. After a moment, he stood and shook himself, his tags jingling. Maya's phone had 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. Most were from numbers she didn't recognize, neighbors she assumed, or county emergency services trying to confirm evacuations. 3 were from Tom Hendricks. "Are you out?" "Maya, answer your phone. If you're alive, please respond." She typed, "I'm alive." Shelter held. "I'm okay." The response came in seconds. "Thank God. Everyone thought you were dead. Don't come outside yet. Fire's still active in the valley." Maya looked at Ash. "Want to see what's left?" The dog's tail wagged once, cautiously. She climbed the concrete stairs to the vestibule and opened the inner door. The steel was warm to the touch, but not dangerously hot. She opened the outer door and stepped into a world that had been transformed. The landscape was black, not the black of rich soil or shadow, but the black of complete combustion. Every tree was gone, not burned down to stumps, but consumed entirely, leaving only ash and the twisted metal of fence posts that had melted in the heat. The rocks that had hidden her entrance were scorched and cracked, and the grass that had covered her roof was gone. But the roof was there. The soil that covered it was baked hard as ceramic, but intact. The ventilation pipes were scorched black, but standing. The entrance was clear. Her shelter had survived. Maya walked across the blackened ground, her boots sinking into ash that was still warm. The ponderosa pines that had shaded her tent for 8 months were gone. The tent itself was gone, vaporized. The pile of lumber she had been saving for future projects, gone. Her truck, parked 100 yards from the shelter entrance, a melted husk of metal and glass. Everything on the surface had been destroyed. Everything below had survived. She stood at the edge of where her property met the Hendricks Ranch and looked west. The fire was still burning in the valley, a line of orange flame crawling through the grass toward the highway. Smoke rose in columns that reached the clouds. And somewhere in that smoke, hidden behind veils of ash and heat shimmer, were all the people who had evacuated, all the people who had thought she was crazy. Her phone buzzed. Another text from Tom. "Cal Fire wants to know if you need rescue. Should I tell them you're okay?" Maya looked at her shelter, half buried in the hillside, invisible except for the entrance and the ventilation pipes. She looked at the moonscape that surrounded it, at the evidence of fire so hot it had sterilized the earth. She typed, "Tell them I'm fine. Tell them my shelter worked exactly as designed." There was a long pause. "Then, I'll tell them. Stay safe." Maya pocketed her phone and called Ash. Together they walked back to the entrance, descended the stairs, and sealed the door behind them. Outside, the fire was still burning. Inside, the temperature was already dropping. The thermal mass releasing the heat it had absorbed, the ventilation system pulling in air that was cleaner with every passing hour. Maya sat on her cot and pulled out her engineering notebook. She had data to record, temperature curves to document, observations about what had worked and what could be improved. Because this fire wouldn't be the last. The climate was changing. The forests were dying. The wind patterns were shifting in ways that made fire season year-round and made every summer a countdown to the next catastrophe. But now she had proof. Proof that going underground wasn't crazy. Proof that Earth could protect what walls and roofs could not. Proof that survival wasn't about fighting fire, but about removing yourself from the equation entirely. She started writing. The fire burned for 6 more days. Maya monitored its progress through her laptop, watching the red perimeter expand and contract as wind shifted and crews established containment lines and lost them again when the fire jumped. She watched the news coverage. Aerial shots of destruction, interviews with evacuees in shelters, officials talking about unprecedented conditions, and resources stretched thin. She watched the footage of her area, the camera panning across blackened ridges and skeletal trees and foundations where homes had stood. The reporter's voice was somber as he described the total loss of structures, the miracle that no lives had been lost in this particular area because everyone had evacuated in time. Everyone except the woman, in the underground shelter they didn't know existed. On the 7th day, the fire was declared 40% contained. The evacuation orders were lifted for some zones, including hers. Tom Hendricks texted, "Coming back up tomorrow to check on the ranch. You want company?" "Sure," she replied. He arrived at noon in a truck that was gray with ash, towing a trailer full of water tanks and supplies. He parked at the dirt road and walked the last quarter-mile because the road itself was impassable, blocked by fallen trees and debris that the fire had scattered. Maya met him at the top of the rise, Ash at her side. Tom stopped when he saw her, his eyes scanning the destruction around them, looking for the structure he expected to see. "Where's your shelter?" he asked. Maya pointed down the slope to where the entrance was barely visible behind the scorched rocks. Tom stared. Then he started walking toward it, his boots crunching through the ash. Maya followed. He stood at the entrance for a long moment, studying the ventilation pipes, the steel door, the way the structure was integrated into the hillside so seamlessly that even now, after fire had stripped away every bit of vegetation, it was nearly invisible. "This is what you were building," he said quietly, "this whole time." "Yes." "And you were inside when the fire came through." "Yes." He turned to look at her, his weathered face unreadable. "The temperature up here hit over 2,000 degrees. Cal Fire said it was one of the hottest burns they've ever recorded. Everything on the surface." He gestured at the blackened landscape. "Everything's gone." "I know. But you were fine." The shelter maintained an interior temperature of 84 degrees. The air quality stayed clean. The systems worked exactly as designed. Tom was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I need to see it." Maya led him down the stairs and through the airlock into the shelter. He moved slowly, taking in the concrete walls, the organized supplies, the bunks and kitchen, and the monitoring systems that still displayed data from the fire's passage. He studied the temperature graphs on her laptop, the recordings from the external sensors, the timeline of the fire moving over and past them. "You engineered this yourself," he said. "Yes." "You knew it would work." "I calculated that it would work." Knowing and calculating are different things. He looked at her, and she saw something in his expression that hadn't been there before. Not pity, not condescension, but respect. "I called you crazy," he said. "You did." "I was wrong." Maya didn't respond. She didn't need to. Tom pulled out his phone and took pictures of the shelter, of the entrance, of the ventilation system, and the monitoring equipment. "Do you mind if I show these to people?" he asked. "There are families who lost everything. People who are trying to figure out how to rebuild. This," he gestured around the shelter, "this is something they need to see." "Show whoever you want," Maya said. Word spread faster than the fire had. Within a week, Maya had 3 engineers from Cal Fire at her door, asking questions about the shelter's design, taking measurements, requesting copies of her plans. They were followed by a reporter from the Sacramento Bee, then a crew from a Bay Area news station, then a documentary filmmaker who wanted to do a feature on underground fire shelters. Maya answered their questions patiently. She showed them the calculations, the material specifications, the ventilation design. She explained the principles of thermal mass and radiant heat protection. She walked them through the timeline of the fire's passage and showed them the data proving that everything had worked. But she didn't let them film inside the shelter. That was her home, her private space, and she wasn't turning it into a spectacle. The attention made her uncomfortable. She had built the shelter for herself, to survive, to prove that there was another way. She hadn't built it for recognition or validation or to be held up as an example. But the people who came weren't looking for a spectacle. They were looking for hope. A young couple who had lost their home in the fire asked if she could help them design something similar. A retired firefighter wanted to know if the concept could be scaled up for community shelters. A woman from Paradise, a survivor like Maya, drove 3 hours just to stand at the entrance and cry. "I thought I was crazy," the woman said. "After Paradise, I couldn't live in a normal house anymore. I sleep in my car most nights because I need to know I can leave fast. Everyone tells me I need therapy, that I need to move on. But you," she looked at the shelter entrance, "you did something about it." "So can you," Maya said. The woman looked at her, hope and fear mixing in her eyes. "You really think so?" "I know so. I'll help you if you want." By November, Maya had helped design 3 underground shelters and consulted on 5 more. She had written a guide to underground fire-resistant construction that was being circulated through survivor networks and shared on forums where people who had lived through fire talked about what came after. She had also started teaching, not in any official capacity, just a workshop she held once a month at a community center in Weaverville, where she explained the basics of thermal mass and ventilation systems and showed people that survival didn't have to mean evacuation. Tom Hendricks came to the first workshop. So did the CAL FIRE engineers. So did 17 people who had lost homes and 12 more who were terrified of losing theirs. Maya stood at the front of the room with her laptop and her diagrams and talked about what she had learned. Not just about engineering, but about fear and resilience and the choice between running from what scared you and building something that could withstand it. "I'm not saying everyone should live underground," she said. "I'm saying we need to think differently about how we build in fire country. We need to design for the reality of what's coming, not for the codes that were written for a climate that doesn't exist anymore." A hand went up in the back. A woman in her 60s, gray-haired and sharp-eyed. "Do you think we can win against these fires?" she asked. Maya thought about that question, about Paradise and the 85 people who didn't make it out, about the years of drought and the forests that were dying and the wind patterns that were shifting, about the fire season that had become fire year. "No," she said honestly, "I don't think we can win, but I think we can survive. And sometimes survival is enough." The winter rains came late that year, and when they finally arrived in December, they fell on a landscape that couldn't absorb them. The fire had burned so hot that it had sterilized the soil, killed the root systems that held the earth in place, turned the mountainside into a slick surface where water ran instead of soaking in. Maya watched from her shelter entrance as mudslides carved new channels down the slopes, carrying ash and debris and the few remaining traces of what had existed before. The erosion was catastrophic. Gullies that were 6 feet deep where there had been gentle grades, boulders the size of cars tumbling down inclines they had rested on for centuries. Her shelter was untouched. The berm she had built from excavated soil had become water diversions, channeling runoff around the structure instead of over it. The grass she had seeded on the roof, dead now from the fire, had left behind roots that still held the soil together enough to prevent collapse. More proof that going underground wasn't just about fire. It was about all the disasters that followed fire. The floods, the mudslides, the poisoned water and contaminated soil, and the years it would take for the land to heal. If it healed at all. Tom Hendricks lost half his cattle barn to a mudslide in January. The structure had survived the fire, but the water undermined its foundation and sent it sliding down the slope in pieces. He called Maya at 6 a.m., his voice shaking. "I need help," he said. She drove down in the 4-wheel drive truck she had bought to replace the one that melted. Used, 15 years old, but functional. Tom met her at what remained of his barn, standing in the rain with his hat pulled low. "I've been ranching this land for 40 years, he said. "My father ranched it for 40 years before that. I've seen drought and fire and floods that washed out roads, but I've never seen this. The land is—" He stopped, searching for words. "It's broken." Maya looked at the mudslide scar, at the barn debris scattered across the slope, at the rain falling on ground that was running brown with ash and soil. "It's not broken," she said. "It's just changed. How do I ranch on land that's changed like this? You adapt, same way I did. He looked at her, water dripping from his hat brim. You got any ideas? Maya pulled out her phone and opened the photos she had taken of her own property, showing him the berms and swales she had built, the way she had used the excavated soil to create water management systems that worked with the terrain instead of against it. You can't stop the water, she said, but you can direct it, use it, make it work for you instead of destroying what you've built. Tom studied the photos for a long time. Then he said, "Will you help me?" "Yes." They worked through the winter, Maya and Tom and a rotating crew of neighbors who had lost structures to mudslides and were desperate for solutions. Maya designed a system of terraces and retention ponds that would slow the water, let it soak in, prevent the kind of catastrophic erosion that had taken Tom's barn. The work was hard and the progress was slow, but it was something, action instead of helplessness, engineering instead of grief. And while they worked, more people came. Some were reporters, still following up on the story of the woman who survived the fire in an underground shelter. But most were survivors themselves, people who had lost homes in this fire or previous fires, people who were trying to rebuild or trying to figure out if rebuilding was even possible. They came with questions Maya didn't always have answers to. How do you finance construction that isn't covered by standard building codes? How do you get insurance for a structure that most companies don't recognize? How do you convince a county building department that your underground shelter is safer than a conventional home when they've never seen anything like it? Maya didn't have all the answers, but she had some, and she shared them freely. The names of engineers who were willing to consult, the building officials who were open to innovative designs, the insurance companies that were starting to recognize that maybe the old ways of building in fire country weren't working anymore. In February, a fire captain from Cal Fire named Marcus Chun contacted her. He had been at the workshop in November and had spent a month since then researching underground shelters and their potential as community fire refuges. "I want to build something," he said when they met at a coffee shop in Reading. "Not a bunker, not a personal shelter, a community refuge. Something big enough to hold 50, maybe 100 people when evacuation isn't possible." Maya set down her coffee. "That's ambitious. We need ambitious. Every year the fires get worse. Every year the evacuation routes get more clogged. We had 3 near-miss situations last season where people almost died because they couldn't get out in time. We need options that aren't just run and hope." "You have funding?" "Not yet. But I have support from the department. And I have land. County property that's designated for emergency services. What I don't have is someone who knows how to design something like this." He looked at her across the table. "I'm asking if you'll do it." Maya thought about Paradise, about the cars that didn't make it out, about the people who died because evacuation was the only option they had and evacuation failed them. "I'll do it," she said. The community shelter project consumed the next 6 months. Maya worked with Marcus and a team of Cal Fire engineers to design a structure that could hold 100 people for up to 72 hours, long enough for even the worst firestorm to pass. The design was more complex than her personal shelter. They needed multiple ventilation systems with redundancy, water storage for 100 people, sanitation that could handle the load, sleeping areas that provided some privacy, and storage for emergency supplies. They needed entrances that were wide enough to accommodate people with mobility issues, but secure enough to seal completely against smoke and heat. They needed approvals from the county, from Cal Fire, from the State Fire Marshal's office. They needed environmental impact studies and soil tests and structural calculations verified by independent engineers. It was exhausting. It was bureaucratic. It was everything Maya had tried to avoid when she built her own shelter. But it was also necessary. The County Planning Commission hearing in April was the first real test. Maya presented the design to a room full of officials who had spent their careers approving conventional construction and who looked at the underground shelter plans like she was proposing to build on Mars. "This is unprecedented," the planning director said, studying the drawings. "We don't have codes for this kind of structure." "Then we need new codes," Maya replied, "because the old codes aren't keeping people alive. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more incredible mountain stories, like this one. A commissioner in the back row, an older woman named Patricia Martinez, who had lived through the car fire, spoke up. I lost my home in 2018. I lost everything except my life because I evacuated in time. But I had friends who didn't evacuate in time. Friends who died in their cars on roads that became death traps. She looked directly at Maya. If this shelter can give people an option besides running, I want to see it built. I don't care if it's unprecedented. The vote was 4-3 in favor. Construction began in May. The site was 3 miles outside of Redding, on a hillside overlooking the Sacramento River Valley, county land that had been designated for emergency services but never developed. The soil was good, decomposed granite with enough clay content to provide stability, but not so much that drainage would be a problem. Maya supervised the excavation, worked with a crew that had never dug anything like this before. The pit was massive, 40 feet wide, 80 feet long, 14 feet deep. The walls had to be shored with timber as they went down, and the soil had to be graded carefully to prevent collapse. It took 3 weeks just to dig. The concrete work took another 2 months. Maya watched as the walls went up in sections, as the rebar was tied and the formwork was built, and the concrete was poured in lifts that had to cure before the next section could begin. She checked every measurement, every joint, every penetration where ventilation pipes and electrical conduits would pass through the walls. There was no room for error. 100 lives would depend on this structure. Maya felt the weight of that responsibility every day. Tom Hendricks came by in June to see the progress. He stood at the edge of the excavation, looking down at the concrete walls that were rising from the earth. "You know what people are calling this?" he asked. "I can imagine." Maya's Arkansas. She laughed despite herself. "That's dramatic." "Maybe, but it's accurate. You're building something to survive what's coming. Something to save people when everything else fails." Maya looked at the structure taking shape below them. "I'm just an engineer, doing what engineers do, solving problems." "No," Tom said. "You're doing what most engineers don't do. You're solving the right problems." The shelter was completed in August, just as fire season was ramping up. Maya walked through the finished space, checking systems and testing equipment, and making sure everything worked the way it was supposed to. The interior was painted white to maximize the light from the LED fixtures. The sleeping areas had bunk beds that could be folded up against the walls when not in use, creating open space for the daytime hours. The kitchen had commercial-grade equipment, a 6-burner stove, industrial refrigeration, enough counter space to prepare meals for 100 people. The ventilation system was the most sophisticated Maya had ever designed. Multiple intake and exhaust points, HEPA filters rated for wildfire smoke, sensors that would automatically seal the system if dangerous levels of heat or particulates were detected, backup generators in case the solar power system failed. Redundancy for everything critical. It was, she thought, the safest place in Northern California during a wildfire. The dedication ceremony was scheduled for September 15th. Cal Fire officials would be there, county commissioners, state legislators who were starting to pay attention to innovative fire safety measures. The media would be there too. Maya had stopped trying to avoid them. If attention brought funding for more community shelters, she could tolerate the cameras. But 2 weeks before the dedication, the Creek Fire started. It began in the Sierra National Forest, 150 miles southeast of Redding. Within 48 hours, it consumed 145,000 acres and was moving through terrain so steep and remote that firefighters couldn't reach it. Within a week, it had burned through 350,000 acres and was still growing. The smoke reached Redding on the 3rd day. Maya watched the sky turn orange, watched the sun become a red disk barely visible through the haze, and felt a familiar tightness in her chest that came with smoke season. But this smoke was different. This smoke was thicker than anything she had seen since Paradise. The air quality index hit 500, hazardous for everyone, not just sensitive groups. Schools closed. Businesses closed. People who had lived through previous fires looked at the sky and knew something was very wrong. On September 8th, 7 days before the dedication ceremony, the winds shifted. The creek fire jumped its containment lines and began moving north, pushed by gusts that reached 60 miles per hour. It crossed highways and rivers and fire breaks that were supposed to stop it. It created its own weather system, generating lightning that started new fires ahead of the main burn, and it was moving toward Redding. Markiston called Maya at midnight. "We need to open the shelter. It's not dedicated yet. We haven't done the final inspections." "I don't care. We have families in the foothill communities who can't evacuate. The roads are blocked by fire. We need to get them somewhere safe, and we need to do it now." Maya looked out her window at the orange glow on the southern horizon. The fire was still 50 miles away. But 50 miles was nothing when winds were this strong, and the fuel load was this dry. "Open it," she said. "I'll be there in an hour." By dawn, there were 37 people in the shelter, families from the mountain communities east of Redding, people who had waited too long to evacuate and found themselves trapped when the fire crossed Highway 299 and cut off their escape route. Maya helped them settle in, showing them where the bathrooms were, where the food was stored, how the ventilation system worked. Most of them were in shock, silent and staring, processing the fact that they had almost died and were now sitting in an underground room that looked like a cross between a church basement and a fallout shelter. A woman named Sarah Martinez, no relation to Commissioner Martinez, had 3 children under the age of 8. She sat on one of the bunks with her youngest in her lap and her other 2 pressed against her sides. "Is this really safe?" she asked Maya. "Yes." "How do you know?" Maya pulled out her phone and showed her the temperature data from her own shelter during the fire last October, showed her the graphs and the calculations, and the proof that Earth could protect what walls and roofs could not. Sarah studied the data for a long time. Then she said, "You survived a fire like this in a shelter you built yourself." "Yes." "And you designed this one." "Yes." Sarah looked around the shelter, at the concrete walls, at the families settling into bunks, at the ventilation pipes and monitoring systems, and all the engineering that had gone into creating this space. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay, I believe you." More families arrived throughout the morning. By noon, there were 53 people. By evening, there were 71. They came in waves, brought by CAL FIRE trucks and sheriff's deputies and volunteers with 4-wheel drive vehicles who were making runs up the mountain roads to grab whoever they could before the fire cut off access completely. The shelter filled with the sounds of frightened children and exhausted adults and a low murmur of people trying to comfort each other in a crisis they hadn't prepared for. Maya moved through space, answering questions and checking systems and trying to project a calm she didn't entirely feel. Because this was different from her own shelter. This wasn't just her life depending on her engineering. This was 71 lives. 71 people who were trusting that she had built something that would save them. At 8 p.m., the power went out in Redding. The fire had taken down transmission lines 20 miles south. The shelter switched to backup generators without a flicker. Maya had designed the system to transition seamlessly. At 10 p.m., the external temperature sensor started climbing. The fire was close now, close enough that radiant heat was beginning to reach the hillside where the shelter was buried. Marcus Chin stood with Maya at the monitoring station, watching the numbers rise. "How hot did it get at your place?" he asked. 2,000 degrees at the peak. "And the shelter?" 84 degrees inside. The thermal mass absorbed the heat. "It'll do the same thing here." He nodded, but she could see the tension in his jaw. He was a fire captain. He had spent 20 years fighting fires and learning what fire could do. He knew the numbers, knew the destructive power of 2,000-degree heat. He also knew that this shelter was full of families who had nowhere else to go. "It'll hold," Maya said. "I promise you it'll hold." The temperature sensor read 200 degrees at 11 p.m. By midnight, it was at 500 degrees. The roar of the fire was audible now, even through 14 feet of earth and 8 inches of concrete. A sound like thunder that didn't stop, that just kept building until it was the only thing anyone could hear. The children were crying. The adults were trying to stay calm, but Maya could see the fear in her eyes. They were underground in a box while the world above them burned. Every survival instinct they had was screaming at them to run, to get out, to find open space and fresh air. But there was no open space. There was no fresh air. There was only this shelter and the promise that it would protect them. 900 degrees, 1,200 degrees, 1,500 degrees. Maya stood at the front of the main room and raised her voice over the roar. I need everyone to listen to me. The room quieted. 71 faces turned toward her. The fire is passing over us right now, she said. It's loud and it's hot and it's terrifying. But this shelter was designed for exactly this situation. The walls are holding. The air is clean. The temperature inside is 78 degrees and holding steady. She pulled out her phone and projected the monitoring data onto the wall using a battery-powered projector. The external temperature was climbing, 1,650 degrees now, but the internal temperature had only risen 3 degrees in the last hour. The Earth is protecting us, she said. The thermal mass is absorbing the heat and releasing it slowly. By the time any significant heat reaches us, the fire will have passed. We're safe here. I promise you we're safe. A man in the back, elderly, weathered, clearly a long-time resident of the foothills, spoke up. How do you know? Because I lived through this exact scenario 9 months ago. Because I watched the temperature outside my shelter hit 2,000 degrees, while I sat inside at 84 degrees. Because the engineering works. Because Earth is the best insulator we have. 1,800 degrees. 1,950 degrees. The roar was constant now, a pressure in the air that made breathing feel difficult even though the oxygen levels were normal. Maya could feel her heart racing, could feel the old panic from paradise trying to claw its way up from wherever she had buried it. But she couldn't panic. Not here. Not now. Not with 71 people watching her for signs of what they should feel. So she stood at the front of the room and projected calm and watched the numbers climb and waited for the fire to pass. 2,000 degrees. The sensor hit its maximum and stopped climbing, just like it had at her shelter, just like she had known it would. This is the peak, she said. The fire is directly over us now. This is the worst it's going to get. Sarah Martinez's youngest child was screaming, a high-pitched wail of terror that cut through the roar of the fire. Sarah held her daughter tight and rocked her and whispered things Maya couldn't hear. The temperature held at 2,000 degrees for 11 minutes. 11 minutes that felt like hours. 11 minutes of standing in that concrete room with 71 people who were trusting their lives to calculations Maya had made in systems she had designed and the belief that Earth could protect what nothing else could. Then the sensor started dropping. 1,900 degrees. 1,750 degrees. 1,500 degrees. The fire was passing. By 2 a.m., the external temperature was down to 400 degrees. The roar had faded to a distant rumble as the fire moved north toward the valley. The internal temperature had peaked at 81 degrees, 3 degrees cooler than Maya's personal shelter had reached. The engineering had worked. 71 people had survived a firestorm that had consumed everything on the surface. Maya sat on the floor in the corner, her back against the concrete wall, her hands shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off. Ash, who she had brought with her when Marcus called, pressed against her side, his gray muzzle resting on her thigh. Marcus' chin sat down beside her. "You did it," he said quietly. "We did it. This was a team effort. No, you designed this. You convinced the county to approve it. You supervised every step of construction. This shelter exists because of you." Maya didn't respond. She was too tired, too overwhelmed, too aware of how close they had come to something catastrophic if any part of the system had failed. "There are going to be questions," Marcus continued. "The media will want to know how an unauthorized shelter ended up saving 71 lives. The county will want to know why we opened a facility that hadn't completed final inspections. There will be paperwork and investigations, and probably some angry bureaucrats." He looked at her. "But 71 people are alive because you built this. Remember that when the questions start." The questions started at dawn. CAL FIRE officials arrived to inspect the shelter and document its condition. County building inspectors came to verify that it was structurally sound. State emergency management personnel came to understand how an experimental shelter had ended up being used as an emergency refuge. And the media came. Camera crews and reporters and photographers who wanted to capture the story of the underground shelter that had saved 71 lives from a fire that had consumed 50,000 acres in a single night. Maya tried to avoid the cameras, but it was impossible. When the family started emerging from the shelter into a landscape that had been transformed into a moonscape of ash and char, when the children stepped into sunlight after 12 hours underground and saw that they had survived, the cameras captured all of it. They captured Sarah Martinez crying as she held her children. They captured the elderly man who had questioned Maya's engineering, now shaking her hand and thanking her. They captured the moment when the shelter door opened and 71 people walked out alive from a space that had been surrounded by 2,000-degree heat just hours before. And they captured Maya standing at the entrance, exhausted and overwhelmed and trying to process what had just happened. The footage went viral. Within 48 hours, Maya's shelter design was being discussed on national news. Within a week, she had interview requests from major networks, inquiries from fire-prone communities across the West, and emails from engineers and architects who wanted to know more about the principles behind underground fire refuges. The county commissioners who had voted against the Shelter Project 3 to 4 apologized publicly and pledged to fast-track approvals for future community shelters. The state legislature announced funding for a pilot program to build 10 more shelters in high-risk areas. CAL FIRE added underground refuge design to their community preparedness recommendations. Everything changed. But for Maya, the most important moment came 3 days after the fire, when she returned to the shelter to help with the cleanup. Sarah Martinez was there with her children, volunteering to organize the donated supplies that were pouring in. She saw Maya and immediately came over. "I need to tell you something," Sarah said. "Before the fire, I thought people who built bunkers were paranoid. I thought preppers were crazy. I thought the answer to fire was just to evacuate faster, to have a better plan, to not be one of the people who waited too long." She paused, her eyes filling with tears. "But we were some of those people. We waited too long. And if this shelter hadn't existed, if you hadn't built it, my children would be dead. We would all be dead." She pulled Maya into a fierce hug. "Thank you. Thank you for being crazy enough to dig a hole in the ground. Thank you for being stubborn enough to make them let you build it. Thank you for saving my babies." Maya hugged her back, and for the first time since paradise, felt something in her chest loosen. Some knot of guilt and grief and the constant question of whether she could have done more, saved more, been faster or smarter or braver. She had saved 71 people. She had proven that there was another way. She had turned her trauma into something that protected others from the same fate. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was something. It was enough. 18 months after the Creek Fire, Maya stood at the dedication ceremony for the 5th community shelter built using her design. This one was in Paradise, or what was being rebuilt as Paradise, the town that had burned, the town that had changed everything. The shelter was larger than the Reading prototype. Capacity for 150 people, with upgraded ventilation systems and seismic reinforcement that would protect against earthquakes as well as fire. It had been funded by a combination of state grants, federal disaster preparedness money, and private donations from survivors who understood what a difference it could make. The ceremony was smaller than the others had been. No media circus this time, just community members and local officials and the families who had pledged to be shelter monitors, the volunteers who would maintain the facility and know how to operate it when the next fire came, because there would be a next fire. Everyone understood that now. Tom Hendricks was there, standing near the back with his wife. He caught Maya's eye and nodded. They had become friends over months of working together, rebuilding his ranch using the same principles of earth integration and water management that had protected her own property. His cattle operation was smaller now, but more resilient, and he had built his own underground shelter, not as elaborate as Maya's, but functional. A place he could go when evacuation wasn't an option. "You've changed how people think," he had told her a few months ago. "Not just about shelters. About everything. About how we live in fire country, how we build, how we prepare. You made it okay to be afraid and to do something about it besides just running. Maya had thought about that conversation often, because that was what had changed, really. Not just the shelters, though those mattered. What had changed was the acceptance that the old ways weren't working anymore, that evacuation wasn't always possible, that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was stand your ground in a shelter built from earth and engineering, and the understanding that survival required adaptation. The Paradise mayor, a woman named Jennifer Ramos, who had lost her own home in a campfire, stepped up to speak. 5 years ago, this town burned. 85 people died. Thousands lost everything. We thought about giving up. We thought about not rebuilding. We thought that maybe Paradise was gone forever. She paused, looking at the shelter entrance behind her, a simple steel door set into a hillside that had been carefully landscaped to blend with the surrounding terrain. But we didn't give up. We rebuilt, and we rebuilt differently. We rebuilt with the understanding that fire will come again, that we can't prevent it, but we can prepare for it. This shelter represents that understanding. It represents the knowledge that we don't have to be victims. We can be survivors. She turned to Maya. And we have Maya Reeves to thank for showing us what's possible. The applause was warm but subdued. These were people who had lived through catastrophe. They need grand gestures. They needed proof that things could be different. Maya stepped up to the microphone. She had gotten better at public speaking over the last year and a half. Not comfortable with it, but functional. She could stand in front of a crowd now, without her hands shaking too badly. I didn't build the first shelter to change the world, she said. I built it because I was terrified, because I had survived one fire and knew I couldn't survive another evacuation, because I needed to believe that there was a way to stay safe without running. She looked at the people gathered, survivors, rebuilders, people who understood what she had felt. What I learned is that engineering isn't just about calculations and materials. It's about understanding what you're protecting against and designing systems that work with reality instead of fighting it. Fire is reality in California now. Permanent, inevitable, getting worse every year. We can't stop it, but we can build for it. We can create spaces that survive. And we can give people options besides evacuation. She gestured to the shelter behind her. This isn't a bunker. It's not a place to hide from the world. It's a place to survive the worst the world can throw at you, so you can come back out and rebuild. So you can stay in the communities you love instead of abandoning them, because the risk is too high. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story. Paradise is being rebuilt by people who refuse to give up. This shelter is part of that refusal, and I'm honored to have been part of making it real. After the ceremony, Maya walked the perimeter of the shelter with Ash, checking the landscaping and the drainage, and the small details that most people wouldn't notice, but that matter for long-term functionality. A young woman approached her, early 20s, carrying a backpack covered in engineering patches. Ms. Reeves, I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm a civil engineering student at Chico State. I'm writing my thesis on underground fire refuges. I was wondering if I could ask you some questions. Maya smiled. She got this a lot now. Students, young engineers, people who were building careers around the new understanding that climate change demanded new approaches to construction and safety. Sure, she said. What do you want to know? How did you know it would work? Before you had any proof, before you had tested it, how did you trust your calculations enough to bet your life on them? Maya thought about that question, about the month of excavation, the nights of doubt, the moment when she had sealed the door with the fire roaring overhead and nothing but mathematics standing between her and death. I didn't know, she said honestly. I believed the engineering was sound. I had checked and rechecked every calculation. But knowing and believing are different things. I believed enough to try, and trying was better than the alternative. The student nodded, making notes. And now, after everything that's happened, after proving the design works, do you ever doubt? Every day, Maya said. Doubt is healthy. It's what makes you check your work, test your systems, plan for failure modes. The dangerous thing isn't doubt. It's certainty. Being so sure you're right that you stop questioning. She looked at the shelter, at the families walking around it, exploring it, understanding that it was theirs to use if they needed it. These shelters aren't perfect, she continued. They're not a complete solution to wildfire. They're one tool among many: evacuation, defensible space, building codes, fuel management. But they're a tool that didn't exist before, a tool that gives people options, and options save lives. The student thanked her and walked away, and Maya continued her inspection with Ash padding quietly beside her. That evening, back at her own shelter, Maya sat at her desk and pulled out the journal she had been keeping. Not an engineering journal this time, but a personal one, a record of the last 18 months, of the changes and the challenges and the strange new life she had built. The entry for today was short. 5th shelter dedicated. Paradise. Full circle and away. Back to where the fear started, but building something that might keep others from feeling that fear, or at least give them a way through it. Tom says I've changed how people think about fire safety. Maybe. Or maybe I've just given voice to what people already knew, but didn't know how to act on. That running isn't always the answer. That sometimes you need to stand your ground. If you prepare the ground to stand on, the work continues. 3 more community shelters in design phase. County in Oregon wants to adapt the plans for their fire-prone areas. Even got a call from Australia after their fires last year. But the real change isn't in the shelters. It's in the conversations. People talking about adaptation instead of just prevention, about resilience instead of just resistance, about working with the reality of climate change instead of pretending we can go back to how things were. We can't go back. The old climate is gone. The old fire seasons are gone. The old ways of building are failing, but we can adapt. We can learn. We can build differently. And maybe that's enough. She closed the journal and looked around her shelter. Home for 18 months now, and it still felt right in a way nothing had felt right since paradise. The concrete walls, the cool air, the absolute security of knowing that no fire could reach her here. Ash was getting old. 12 years now, gray around his entire muzzle, moving slower than he used to. But he still slept beside her every night, still pressed his shoulder against her leg when she needed the comfort, still understood the things she didn't say. "Good dog," she said, scratching behind his ears. "Best dog." His tail thumped against the floor. Maya turned off the lights except for one small lamp and lay down on her cot. Tomorrow she would drive to Sacramento to meet with state emergency management about expanding the shelter program. Next week she was teaching another workshop for people who wanted to build their own shelters. Next month she had a speaking engagement at a conference on climate adaptation and resilient infrastructure. The work never stopped, but it was good work. Work that mattered. Work that saved lives. She thought about the 71 people in the Redding shelter, about Sarah Martinez's children, who sent her drawings sometimes of the underground shelter that had saved them, about the families in Paradise who would have a refuge now if fire came again, about all the people in fire country who were starting to understand that they had options besides evacuation or risk. She thought about the woman she had been 5 years ago, running through smoke, losing everything, barely surviving. That woman had been broken, traumatized, unable to trust anything or anyone. This woman was different, still carrying scars, still sometimes waking at night from dreams of fire and smoke and the sound of people screaming, but also stronger, more certain of her purpose, building instead of running, creating instead of hiding. The transformation wasn't complete. Maybe it never would be. Trauma didn't just disappear because you did something good. Fear didn't vanish because you proved you could survive. But she had learned to live with both, had learned that being afraid didn't make you weak, as long as you didn't let the fear paralyze you, had learned that trauma could be transformed into purpose if you were willing to do the work. She had done the work, was still doing it, would probably be doing it for the rest of her life. And that was okay. Outside, somewhere above 18 inches of earth and 6 inches of concrete, the wind was picking up. Fire season was starting again. The grass was dry. The forests were stressed. The conditions were aligning for another bad year. But Maya wasn't afraid. She was prepared. And that made all the difference. The end. Part 4 word count. 2,000 words. Total script word count. 13,500 words. Script complete. This Mountain Woman Underdog mystery script totals approximately 13,500 words across 4 parts, featuring white heavy checkmark emotional authenticity, Maya's trauma from paradise, her transformation from fear to purpose, white heavy checkmark sensory immersion, fire sounds, smoke smell, concrete textures, earth protection, white heavy checkmark mystery pacing, gradual revelation of shelter's effectiveness, from personal survival to community salvation, white heavy checkmark vindication structure, neighbors mockery, fire vindication, community recognition, expanded impact, white heavy checkmark character transformation, from broken survivor to resilient builder to community leader, white heavy checkmark supporting cast, Tom Hendricks, skeptic to ally, Sarah Martinez, save family, Marcus Chun, fire captain ally, white heavy checkmark all 3 CTAs placed at specified intervals, white heavy checkmark realistic engineering details, thermal mass, ventilation systems, fire behavior, white heavy checkmark animal companion, Ash the blue healer as constant presence, white heavy checkmark proper pacing, slow burn buildup, intense fire sequence, satisfying resolution. The script follows the tone and emotional depth of your inspiration videos while telling a unique story about engineering, adaptation, and finding purpose through trauma. Part 5, 10:34 a.m. Part 5, The Legacy. 3 years after Creek Fire, Maya received a letter that changed everything again. It arrived on a Tuesday in March, forwarded to the Cal Fire office because the sender didn't have her personal address. The envelope was thick, official-looking, with a return address from the California State Legislature. Maya opened it standing at her kitchen counter. She had expanded the shelter the previous year, adding a second room that served as a proper kitchen and office space. Ash lay in his bed in the corner, his breathing slow and steady. He was 13 now, sleeping more than he was awake, but still her constant companion. The letter was an invitation, or more accurately, a request. Dear Ms. Reeves, the California State Senate Committee on Emergency Management would like to invite you to testify before the committee regarding proposed legislation that would establish statewide building standards for underground fire refuges and mandate community shelter construction in high-risk fire zones. Your expertise and experience with underground shelter design, as well as your role in the successful deployment of the Redding Community Shelter during the Creek Fire, make you uniquely qualified to provide guidance on this legislation. The committee hearing is scheduled for April 15th in Sacramento. We would be honored by your participation. Maya set the letter down and stared out the small window she had installed in the kitchen expansion. The window faced south, letting in light while maintaining the shelter's thermal properties. Through it, she could see the slope where she had first started digging 4 years ago. The landscape had recovered somewhat. The native grasses had come back. A few young pines were beginning to establish themselves, though it would be decades before they reached the size of the trees that had burned. The land remembered the fire, would always remember it, but it was healing in its own way, testifying before the state legislature, making her shelter design not just accepted, but mandatory in some areas. It should have felt like a victory. It felt like responsibility, weighing down on her shoulders until she could barely breathe. She called Tom Hendricks. They want me to testify in Sacramento, she said when he answered, about making underground shelters a building requirement. That's good, isn't it? I don't know. What if I'm wrong? What if there's something I haven't thought of, some failure mode I haven't planned for? What if they build 100 shelters based on my design and one of them fails and people die? Tom was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Maya, how many people have died in shelters you designed? None. How many people have been saved? 71 in Redding. 43 in the Paradise Shelter during that flare-up last fall. Maybe another 30 in the smaller shelters that people built using your plans. So you saved at least 144 lives with your design. Probably more that we don't know about. And you're worried about hypothetical failures in hypothetical shelters that haven't even been built yet. Yes, that's what makes you good at this. That's why they want you to testify. Because you understand that every design choice matters. Because you won't cut corners or oversimplify. Because you're terrified of being wrong. He paused. But Maya, being terrified doesn't mean you get to hide. You prove the concept works. Now you have to help make sure it's implemented correctly. That's the responsibility that comes with innovation. Maya spent the next 3 weeks preparing for the testimony. She compiled data from every shelter she had designed. Temperature curves, air quality measurements, structural assessments, user feedback. She reviewed the proposed legislation line by line, noting places where the language was too vague, or the requirements too stringent, or the specifications didn't match real-world conditions. She consulted with structural engineers, fire scientists, emergency management professionals. She built models and ran simulations and tested every assumption until she was confident that she understood not just what worked, but why it worked and under what conditions it might fail. Marcus Chun helped her practice her presentation. He sat in her shelter's main room while she went through her slides, stopping her when she got too technical or too defensive or too caught up in details that legislators wouldn't care about. "You're not trying to teach them engineering," he said. "You're trying to convince them that this is necessary and doable and worth the cost. Tell them about Sarah Martinez's kids. Tell them about the 71 people who would be dead without the Redding shelter. Make it human, not just mathematical. But the mathematics matter. The mathematics got you here. The human stories will get the legislation passed." On April 14th, Maya drove to Sacramento. She stayed in a hotel that night. Her first time sleeping above ground in a building with conventional walls and a conventional roof in nearly 4 years. She barely slept, too aware of the vulnerability, too conscious of fire alarms and sprinkler systems that were supposed to protect her, but felt inadequate compared to 18 inches of earth. The committee hearing was scheduled for 10 a.m. Maya arrived at 8:30. Sitting in the hallway outside the hearing room with her laptop and her notes, and a hollow feeling in her stomach that came with high-stakes situations. Other people were there too. Fire chiefs, city planners, representatives from building industry groups who were either supporting or opposing the legislation depending on how it affected their bottom line. She recognized a few faces from conferences and workshops, people who nodded at her with respect or wariness or calculation. At 9:45, a legislative aide came to brief her. "You'll have 10 minutes to present. Then the committee members will ask questions. Try to keep your answers under 2 minutes each." "And Ms. Reeves," the aide lowered her voice, "there are some members who think this legislation is government overreach. They'll challenge you. Stay calm and stick to the facts." "I can do that," Maya said more confidently than she felt. The hearing room was larger than she expected, with high ceilings and with paneling in a gallery where press and public could observe. The committee members sat at an elevated bench, 7 senators who would decide whether her shelter design became part of California's building code or remained an interesting experiment. Maya was the third person to testify. She watched the first 2 speakers, a fire chief supporting the legislation and a developers association representative opposing on cost grounds, and tried to calm her racing heart. Then her name was called. She walked to the witness table, set up her laptop, and looked at the committee members. They looked back with expressions ranging from interested to skeptical to openly hostile. Senator Patricia Martinez, the same Patricia Martinez who had been a county commissioner and had lost her home in the car fire, was chairing the committee. She smiled at Maya, a small gesture of encouragement. "Ms. Reeves, thank you for being here. Please proceed with your testimony." Maya took a breath and began. "4 years ago, I was a structural engineer designing conventional homes in Paradise. I watched those homes burn in a matter of hours. I watched 85 people die because evacuation failed and conventional structures couldn't protect them." She pulled up the first slide, an aerial photo of Paradise after the campfire. The devastation was total, acres of foundations, and ash where a town used to be. "I survived because I was lucky, but I knew I couldn't trust luck again. So I designed an underground shelter that would give me an option beside evacuation. A shelter that would protect me from fire by removing me from the fire's reach entirely." Next slide. Her shelter under construction, the excavation and concrete walls and the systems that made it work. The engineering principles are simple. Earth is an excellent insulator. Underground structures aren't exposed to radiant heat or wind-driven embers. Properly designed ventilation can seal against smoke while maintaining breathable air. The thermal mass of soil buffers temperature extremes. She showed the temperature data from her shelter during the fire. The external sensor reading 2,000 degrees, while the internal temperature held at 84 degrees. This works. It's not theoretical. It's proven. During the Creek Fire, 71 people survived in an underground shelter I designed while the landscape around them reached temperatures hot enough to melt glass. Next slide. Photos from inside the Redding shelter during the fire. Families on bunks, children sleeping, adults looking scared but safe. These people would be dead if conventional evacuation had been their only option. The roads were blocked. The fire moved too fast. There was nowhere to run, but they had somewhere to shelter. And they survived. She looked directly at the committee members. This legislation isn't about replacing evacuation. It's about providing backup when evacuation fails. It's about giving communities in high-risk areas a tool they don't currently have. It's about acknowledging that fire is getting worse, that evacuation routes will fail, and that we need multiple strategies for survival. She paused, then delivered the line Marcus had helped her prepare. The question isn't whether we can afford to build these shelters. It's whether we can afford not to. The question started immediately. Senator Roderick, a Republican from a rural district, leaned forward. Ms. Reeves, this legislation would require communities to build these shelters at significant public expense. In a time of budget constraints, how do you justify that cost? The Redding shelter cost $380,000 to build, Maya replied. It saved 71 lives. That's roughly $5,300 per life saved. The economic value of a statistical life, as calculated by federal agencies, is approximately $10 million. So that shelter generated about $710 million in value for a $380,000 investment. From a pure cost-benefit perspective, it's one of the best investments a community can make. Senator Roderick's eyebrows went up, but he nodded. Senator Kim, a Democrat from San Francisco, asked, "What about maintenance? Are these shelters going to become expensive white elephants that communities can't afford to maintain?" The beauty of underground structures is that they require minimal maintenance, Maya said. No roof to replace. No siding to paint. The concrete is protected from weathering. The ventilation systems need annual filter changes, which cost about $500. The main ongoing cost is training shelter monitors, which can be done by volunteers. Total annual maintenance cost for a 100-person shelter is roughly $2,000. More questions followed about accessibility for people with disabilities. Maya had designed ramps and wider corridors in the newer shelters. About psychological effects of being underground. Studies from a Redding shelter showed no adverse effects from the 12-hour stay. About whether the shelters could be used for other emergencies. Yes, they were also effective for earthquakes, tornadoes, and hazmat incidents. Senator Martinez asked the final question. Ms. Reeves, you become something of an accidental expert in this field. If this legislation passes, what would you recommend as the next steps for implementation? Maya had prepared for this. First, establish design standards that are flexible enough to accommodate different soil conditions and community needs, but rigid enough to ensure safety. Second, create a certification program for engineers and contractors who build these shelters. Third, provide grant funding for low-income communities that can't afford construction costs. And fourth, integrate shelter location data into emergency management systems so people know where to go when evacuation isn't possible. She paused and added, and we should start building them now. Not next year, not when the next fire comes. Now, because the next fire is coming, and it won't wait for us to be ready. The hearing ended. Maya packed up her laptop and walked out into the hallway, where Marcus was waiting. You did great, he said. I forgot to mention the seismic reinforcement in the newer designs. You can't mention everything. You hit the important points. You made them see that this is about saving lives, not just checking a regulatory box. A reporter from the Sacramento Bee approached, asking for an interview. then another from a local TV station. Maya answered their questions patiently, repeating the key messages about cost-effectiveness and proven performance, and a need to act before the next disaster. As she was leaving the Capitol building, her phone rang. Unknown number. Ms. Reeves? This is Jennifer Ramos, the mayor of Paradise. I was watching the live stream of your testimony. I wanted to tell you that the town council voted last night to fund 2 more shelters using your design. We're going to have coverage for the entire rebuilt area. Maya felt something catch in her throat. That's wonderful. It's because of you. Because you showed us that we don't have to live in fear. We can prepare. We can build for the reality of what's coming. Thank you for that. The legislation passed the committee by a vote of 5-2. It would go to the full Senate next, then to the Assembly, then to the governor's desk. The process would take months, maybe longer, but it was moving forward. Maya drove back to her shelter in the foothills, windows down, letting the spring air wash over her. The grass was green from the winter rains. The young pines were putting out new growth. The landscape was in that brief moment between wet season and fire season when everything felt possible. Ash was waiting for her at the entrance, tail wagging slowly. He had arthritis in his hips now, and the stairs were getting difficult for him. Maya had been thinking about installing a dog ramp, or maybe building an above-ground room where he could rest without having to navigate the stairs every time he needed to go outside. The thought of building above ground didn't terrify her the way it used to. Not because the fear was gone, but because she had learned that fear could coexist with action. That being afraid of fire didn't mean you had to hide underground forever. It just meant you had to be smart about how you built, and where you built, and what protections you put in place. She was learning to live with fear instead of being controlled by it. That was growth, she supposed. Inside the shelter, she made dinner, rice and beans and vegetables from the garden she had planted on the surface last fall. The garden had done surprisingly well, the soil enriched by ash and the plants selected for drought tolerance. She was learning to work with the post-fire landscape, to find what could thrive in these conditions rather than mourning what couldn't. After dinner, she opened her laptop and found 17 emails waiting, 3 from communities wanting to build shelters, 4 from engineering students wanting to interview her for research projects, 2 from news outlets wanting follow-up interviews about the legislation, and 1 from Sarah Martinez. Dear Maya, I wanted you to know that my daughter Emma wrote an essay for her 5th grade class about what she wants to be when she grows up. She wrote that she wants to be an engineer like you. She wants to build things that keep people safe. I'm attaching the essay. I thought you might like to read it. Thank you for saving our lives. Thank you for showing Emma that scared people can do brave things. Thank you for being exactly who you are, with love and gratitude. Sarah. Maya opened the attachment. The essay was written in the enthusiastic, slightly uneven handwriting of a 10-year-old. It described the night of the creek fire, the fear of being trapped, the shelter that had protected them. When I grow up, Emma had written, I want to build things that save people like Ms. Reeves saved us. I want to be an engineer who knows how to make scared people safe. I want to be brave like her. Ms. Reeves says she was scared too. She says being scared is okay as long as you don't let it stop you from doing what needs to be done. I think that's what being brave really means. Maya read the essay 3 times, then closed her laptop and sat in the quiet of her shelter. Ash snored softly in his bed. The ventilation system hummed its constant background note. The LED strips cast their even light across concrete walls that had protected her through fires and storms and the long process of healing. She had set out to save herself. She had ended up saving others. She had turned trauma into purpose, fear into action, isolation into community. The work wasn't finished. The legislation might still fail. The next fire would still come. The climate would keep changing and the risks would keep growing, and there would always be new challenges to face. But she wasn't facing them alone anymore. There were other engineers now, learning her techniques, other communities building shelters, other people choosing adaptation over evacuation, preparation over panic. Emma Martinez wanted to be an engineer because of her, a 10-year-old girl who had survived fire and learned that survival could be built, designed, calculated into existence through careful thought and stubborn determination. That was legacy, not the shelters themselves, though those mattered, not the legislation, though that mattered too. The real legacy was showing people, especially young people, especially girls who might not otherwise see themselves in engineering, that you could be scared and smart and capable all at once, that you could survive catastrophe and build something meaningful from the rubble. Maya pulled out her journal and wrote, "Testified before state legislature today. Terrifying, but I did it. Emma Martinez wants to be an engineer, a 10-year-old who survived the creek fire and learned that fear doesn't have to be paralyzing. That engineering can be about courage as much as calculations. Maybe that's the point of all this. Not just the shelters, but showing people that we have agency even in crisis, that we can build for the disasters we know are coming, that adaptation is possible. The fires will keep coming. The climate will keep changing. But we can change too. We can learn, design, build, protect. We can survive. And survival, informed, prepared, engineered survival, might be the most radical act of hope there is." She closed the journal and turned off all the lights except one. Tomorrow she would answer the emails, start designing the next shelter, continue the work that had somehow become her life's purpose. But tonight, she would just sit in the shelter she had built with her own hands, with her old dog sleeping beside her, and feel something that had been absent for her so long she had almost forgotten what it felt like. Peace. Not perfect, not permanent, but real. And for now, that was enough. 7 years after Maya Reeves dug the first shovelful of earth for her underground shelter, a wildfire larger than any in California's recorded history swept across the northern Sierra Nevada. The August Complex Fire, they called it, though calling it a single fire was misleading. It was a constellation of fires that merged into a firestorm covering over 1 million acres, creating its own weather patterns, generating lightning that started new fires 50 miles ahead of the main burn, producing smoke columns that reached the stratosphere and scattered ash across 3 states. Maya watched it approach from the monitoring station she had built on the ridge above her shelter. The station was a small above-ground structure now. She'd gotten comfortable with surface buildings again, though she still slept underground. The station had weather instruments, fire cameras, and direct communication links to CAL FIRE and the National Weather Service. The fire was still 60 miles away, but she could see the smoke wall rising like a mountain range made of ash. The air quality index in her area had hit 450. The sky was the color of a bruise, and the wind was picking up, gusting from the northeast, pushing the fire toward a network of communities that had sprung up or rebuilt in the foothills. Communities that now had shelters. 23 underground fire refuges had been built in Northern California since the legislation passed 3 years ago. 15 more were under construction. The designs varied. Some were small, family-sized shelters built by individuals using Maya's freely available plans. Others were large community facilities funded by state grants and local taxes, built to hold 200 or more people. All of them followed the principles Maya had proven: depth for thermal protection, proper ventilation with smoke filtration, structural reinforcement to bear earth loads, and integration with the landscape to minimize exposure. And now they would all be tested at once. Maya's phone rang. It was Marcus Chun, now the Regional Fire Management Coordinator for Northern California. "It's going to be bad," he said without preamble. "Worse than the creek fire. The models are showing potential for complete structure loss across a 100-mile front. We're implementing mandatory evacuations, but Maya," he paused, "we're not going to get everyone out in time. How many shelters are in the projected burn zone? 11 community facilities, maybe 40 private shelters. Total capacity around 1,500 people, plus however many are in the private builds we don't have documentation for. 1,500 people, maybe more, all of them trusting that the engineering would hold, that the principles would work, that Maya hadn't missed something critical in her designs. The shelters will hold," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "I know they will. But Maya, I need you to be available for media. When this is over, when those 1,500 people walk out alive from under a 1-million-acre fire, the world is going to want to hear from you. This is going to change everything." After he hung up, Maya stood at the monitoring station and watched the smoke advance. Ash was inside the shelter, too old now to make the climb up to the ridge. He was 14, sleeping most of the day, his muzzle completely white, his back legs weak. The vet had said he probably had months, maybe a year if she was lucky. She wasn't ready to lose him. But then, you were never ready to lose the ones who had been with you through everything. Her phone buzzed again. A text from Tom Hendricks. Taking the family to the shelter. Roads are already backing up. You staying? Yes, she typed back. I'll monitor from here and drop to the shelter if it gets close. Be safe. And Maya, thank you for everything. She pocketed her phone and returned to the instruments. The temperature was rising, 93 degrees now, and it wasn't even noon. The humidity had dropped to 6%. Red flag conditions. The kind of weather that turned fires into monsters. Her satellite phone rang, the one reserved for official emergency communications. She answered. Ms. Reeves? This is Governor Newsom's office. The governor is implementing the state emergency operations plan. He specifically requested that you serve as technical advisor for the underground shelter network. Can you accept that role? Maya felt something cold settle in her stomach. What does that entail? Real-time communication with shelter managers across the burn zone. Technical support if any facilities experience problems. Assessment and recommendations for emergency services. The governor wants someone who understands these systems, coordinating their use during the fire. I accept. Within an hour, Maya's laptop was displaying a map of Northern California with 23 red dots marking the community shelters and estimated locations of 40 blue dots for private shelters. Each dot had a status indicator. Green for normal operations, yellow for elevated alert, red for emergency conditions. All of them were currently green. But the fire was coming. The first shelter to go to yellow status was Paradise Shelter Number 2, the facility that had been completed 2 years ago. Maya pulled up the status report. External temperature rising rapidly, air quality degrading. Shelter manager reporting smoke visible on the eastern horizon. She opened the communication channel. Paradise 2, this is base. What's your current population? A woman's voice came through. Jennifer Ramos, the mayor, who had trained as a shelter manager. We have 93 people currently. Families from the eastern developments who couldn't evacuate in time. We're sealed and monitoring. Understood. Your systems are all functioning normally. You know the drill. Maintain seal, monitor air quality, stay calm. You've got this. Copy that, base. And Maya, tell Emma her shelter's working exactly like you said it would. Maya felt her throat tighten. Emma Martinez was 16 now, a junior in high school, already taking AP Physics and Calculus with plans to study structural engineering. She had volunteered as a shelter monitor last summer, learning the systems, understanding how everything worked. If Emma was in that shelter, that meant Sarah and her other children were there too. The family Maya had saved 7 years ago. Trusting the engineering again. Tell her I said to keep taking notes. Maya replied. She's going to need them when she designs her own shelter someday. Over the next 6 hours, Maya watched the map fill with yellow dots, then red. The fire was moving faster than the models had predicted. Winds gusting to 70 miles per hour, humidity dropping to 4%, temperatures spiking to levels that turned vegetation into explosives waiting for ignition. The Paradise shelters went red first, then the Redding shelter, then the facilities in Shasta Lake, Anderson, and Red Bluff. Private shelters across the foothills reported external temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees. Maya coordinated with each facility, monitoring their systems, troubleshooting problems, providing reassurance when shelter managers reported the terrifying sound of fire passing overhead. One shelter in Cottonwood reported a ventilation system malfunction, a filter that wasn't sealing properly. Maya walked the shelter manager through the backup procedure, switching to an alternate intake that used a different filter bank. The fix worked. The shelter maintained air quality. Another shelter near Shasta Lake reported rising internal temperatures. The external heat was overwhelming the thermal mass faster than expected. Maya calculated heat transfer rates on the fly and determined they had enough buffer time. The internal temperature peaked at 91 degrees before the fire passed, and the system began cooling. Every problem had a solution. Every crisis had a response. The engineering held, but the external temperatures kept climbing. Maya watched the sensor readings from the Paradise No. 2 shelter climb to 1,800 degrees, then 1,950 degrees, then max out at 2,000 degrees, the limit of what the sensors could measure. Her own shelter from 7 years ago had experienced 2,000 degrees, but that was a single structure in a localized fire. This was 11 community shelters and 40 private shelters, all experiencing extreme conditions simultaneously. This was 1,500 people or more, all underground, all trusting that the calculations were right, all trusting her. Maya's hands were shaking as she typed status updates, coordinated with emergency services, monitored system performance across the entire network. She hadn't eaten since morning, hadn't left the monitoring station except to use the bathroom. Couldn't leave, not while 1,500 lives depended on her being available if something went wrong. Marcus called at 6 p.m. the fire's cross Highway 5. It's burning in areas that haven't burned in 50 years. The fuel load is, Maya, I've never seen anything like this. How are the shelters? All still reporting green or yellow status. No catastrophic failures. No injuries. The system is working. The system is being tested like it's never been tested before. And it's holding. Maya, you built something that's saving more than 1,000 lives right now. Do you understand that? While we're sitting here watching the biggest fire in California history, 1,500 people are sitting safely underground in structures you designed. Maya looked at the map, at the red dots scattered across the burn zone, each one representing dozens or hundreds of people who weren't running, weren't trapped on clogged highways, weren't dying in their cars or their homes. It's not over yet, she said. The fire burned for 11 days. 11 days of monitoring systems, coordinating responses, providing technical support to shelter managers who were protecting their communities. 11 days of watching external temperature sensors spike and internal temperatures rise and ventilation systems strain under conditions they were designed for but had never been tested against at this scale. Maya slept in 2-hour shifts at the monitoring station, unable to go down to her own shelter because she needed to stay connected to the satellite communication system. Tom Hendricks brought her food. Marcus sent updates on fire behavior and evacuation progress. And slowly, impossibly, the shelters held. On day 4, the Paradise No. 2 shelter reported a minor water leak, condensation from the extreme temperature differential overwhelming the drainage system. Maya guided them through installing a temporary sump pump using equipment from the shelter's emergency supplies. Problem solved. On day 7, a private shelter near Millville reported CO2 levels rising. Too many people in too small a space. Maya calculated their air supply and determined they could safely crack the external vent for 30 seconds every hour to flush the CO2 without compromising safety. Problem solved. On day 9, the Redding shelter's backup generator failed, but the primary solar system was functioning, and the fire had passed 3 days earlier. They had power. Problem solved. Every challenge had a solution. Every crisis had been planned for, designed around, engineered out of existence through careful thought and redundant systems, and the understanding that failure was an option when lives were at stake. On day 11, the last shelter went from red to yellow status. External temperatures dropping, air quality improving, conditions stabilizing. The fire was still burning, still consuming acres and spreading, but the immediate crisis had passed. Maya pulled up the final status report. 23 community shelters, all operational, 0 casualties, 41 private shelters reporting. All operational, 0 casualties, total population protected, 1,647 people system failures, 0 lives lost, 0. 1,500 people had been her estimate. The actual number was 1,647. Every one of them alive because they had a place to shelter when evacuation failed. 0 casualties. Maya stared at the numbers until they blurred. Then she put her head down on the desk and cried. Not from grief this time, but from relief so profound it felt like her entire body was releasing tension she'd been holding for 7 years. The engineering had worked. not just in one shelter, not just under ideal conditions, but across an entire network, under the worst fire conditions in recorded history. It had worked. The media attention that followed was overwhelming in ways Maya wasn't prepared for. National news coverage of the underground shelter network that saved 1,600 lives, feature stories in engineering journals, architecture magazines, disaster preparedness publications, interview requests from 60 Minutes, from NPR, from the BBC and networks around the world, where wildfire was becoming a global crisis. The governor held a press conference 2 weeks after the fire was contained. Maya stood beside him, uncomfortable in the blazer someone had convinced her to wear, while he announced expanded funding for underground shelter construction and new building codes that would make fire refuges mandatory in the highest-risk areas. Maya Reeves has demonstrated what's possible when we think differently about disaster preparedness, the governor said. When we stop asking, how do we prevent fire, and start asking, how we survive fire when it comes. These shelters represent a paradigm shift in how we approach wildfire safety. After the press conference, Maya was surrounded by reporters. She answered their questions mechanically, repeating the key point about thermal mass and ventilation systems and the importance of redundant design. But the question that stuck with her came from a young reporter who looked barely out of college. Ms. Reeves, you lost everything in Paradise. You were traumatized, isolated, terrified, and you turned that trauma into something that's now saved thousands of lives. What would you say to other people who are living with disaster trauma? Maya thought about that question, about the 7 years since Paradise, the work and the fear and the slow process of building something meaningful from the wreckage of loss. I would say that trauma doesn't have to be the end of your story, she said slowly. It can be the beginning of a different story, a story where you take what hurt you and use it to protect others, where you take what scared you and turn it into purpose. She paused, looking at the reporters, thinking about all the people watching this interview, all the survivors of all the disasters who were trying to figure out how to keep living. You don't have to be an engineer, she continued. You don't have to build shelters, but you can take your knowledge, your experience, your understanding of what survival really means, and you can use it. You can help. You can make the world a little safer for the people who come after you. And that's enough to heal? No, Maya said honestly. Trauma doesn't heal completely, but it can transform. It can become something that drives you forward instead of holding you back. And sometimes transformation is better than healing. 3 months after the August complex fire, Maya received an unexpected visitor. She was working the garden. A proper garden now, 2 acres of vegetables and fruit trees and native plants that had adapted to the post-fire landscape. When a car pulled up, a woman got out, young, maybe mid-20s, with nervous energy and a backpack covered in engineering patches. Ms. Reeves? I'm sorry to just show up, but I couldn't reach you by email or phone, and I needed to meet you. Maya set down her shovel and wiped her hands on her jeans. Do I know you? No, but the woman took a breath. My name is Dr. Emma Martinez. I just finished my doctorate in structural engineering at Berkeley. My dissertation was on advanced underground shelter design for extreme fire conditions. And I wouldn't be here, wouldn't be an engineer at all, if you hadn't built the shelter that saved my life when I was 10 years old. Maya stared. Emma? Sarah's daughter? Yes. Emma pulled out her phone and showed Maya a photo. Emma at her dissertation defense, standing in front of a presentation titled Next Generation Underground Fire Refuge Systems, expanding on the Reeves model. I defended 2 weeks ago, Emma said. I got job offers from 3 firms doing disaster resilience engineering, but I turned them all down because I want to work with you. I want to help expand the shelter network. I want to be part of making sure what happened to me, being saved by a shelter, happens to as many people as possible. Maya felt something catch in her chest. Emma, I'm not running a firm. I'm just a consultant who designs shelters and helps communities implement them. I know. That's exactly what I want to do. Not corporate engineering for profit. Engineering for purpose. Engineering that saves lives. Emma met her eyes. You showed me what was possible. Let me help you make more of it possible. Maya looked at this young woman who had survived fire and fear, and had turned both into a career dedicated to protecting others. Looked at the future of everything she had built, standing in her garden asking for a chance to carry it forward. "Okay," Maya said, "but I should warn you, the pay is terrible, the work is exhausting, and you'll spend a lot of time arguing with building officials who think you're crazy." Emma grinned. "Sounds perfect." They worked together for the next 4 years, Maya and Emma, designing shelters and training engineers and testifying before legislative bodies in California and Oregon and Washington and Montana. The underground fire refuge concept spread beyond California, adapted for different climates and fire regimes and community needs. Emma brought energy and innovation that Maya hadn't realized she was missing. She pushed the designs forward, improving ventilation efficiency, reducing construction costs, developing modular systems that could be adapted to different sites. She was fearless in ways Maya had never been, willing to experiment and take risks and challenge assumptions. Maya realized everything Maya had been trying to become when she first started digging 7 years ago. Young and brilliant, and driven by purpose instead of profit. Tom Hendricks said it best, visiting the office they had set up in a renovated barn on Maya's property. "You built shelters," he told Maya. "But Emma is a shelter. The next generation you protected by refusing to give up. That's the real legacy." Ash died in his sleep on a cool October evening, 14 and a half years old, peacefully in his bed in Maya's shelter. Maya buried him on the ridge where she had first started digging, under a young pine that had grown from the post-fire landscape. Emma helped her dig the grave. They worked in silence, two engineers who understood that some things couldn't be calculated or designed, only endured. "He was with you through everything," Emma said when they finished. "He was from the beginning." Maya placed a stone on the grave, granite from the original excavation, a piece of the earth that had protected them both. "I don't know if I would have made it without him." "You would have, but he made it better." They stood there as the sun set, painting the mountains gold and red and purple. The same mountains that had burned repeatedly, that would burn again, but that people now knew how to survive. 10 years after Maya Reeves began digging her first shelter, the Underground Fire Refuge Network had expanded to include 127 community facilities and an estimated 800 private shelters across the western United States. The network had protected more than 8,000 people during major fire events. 0 casualties in any properly constructed shelter. 0 catastrophic failures. The paradigm had shifted. Underground shelters weren't seen as extreme or paranoid anymore. They were seen as practical, necessary, smart engineering for a climate that was producing fires beyond anything humans had prepared for. And Maya, no longer young, no longer alone, no longer running from fear but running toward purpose, stood at the dedication ceremony for Paradise Shelter Number 5 and looked at what had been built. The town had been rebuilt around its shelters. 5 facilities strategically placed provide coverage for every neighborhood, every school, every major employer. The shelters were integrated into community life, used as emergency operations centers during fires, as cooling centers during heat waves, as community gathering spaces year-round. Paradise hadn't just survived. It had adapted. Sarah Martinez was there with her family. Emma was there with her engineering team. Tom Hendricks was there, gray-haired now, retired from ranching but consulting on agricultural fire preparedness. Marcus Chun was there, promoted to state fire marshal, overseeing the entire shelter network. And Commissioner Patricia Martinez, Senator Martinez now, gave the dedication speech. 10 years ago, one woman decided that fear could be transformed into action, that trauma could become purpose, that the solution to fire wasn't just running away, but building places to shelter in place when running wasn't possible. She looked directly at Maya. That woman was told she was crazy, that her underground shelter was paranoid, excessive, a waste of resources. She was mocked and dismissed and doubted, and she saved 8,000 lives. The applause was warm, sustained. Maya stood and accepted it, uncomfortable with the attention, but understanding that it wasn't really about her anymore. It was about the idea she had proven, that adaptation was possible, that engineering could provide hope, that humanity could build for the disasters it knew were coming. When the ceremony ended, Emma found her. "There's someone I want you to meet." She led Maya to a teenage girl standing with her parents. The girl, maybe 14, holding a notebook covered in sketches and calculations. "This is Alicia," Emma said. "She survived the Mendocino fire in the shelter I designed. She's decided she wants to be an engineer." The girl looked up at Maya with eyes that reflected the same determination Maya had seen in Emma 10 years ago. "Ms. Reeves, Dr. Martinez says you'll review my shelter design project for my science fair. Would you?" Maya took the notebook and flipped through the pages. The designs were rough. The calculations had errors. But the thinking was sound. The understanding was there. "I'll do better than review it," Maya said. "I'll help you build it. A scale model we can test. You'll learn more from building than from just designing." Alicia's eyes went wide. "Really? Really? That's how I learned. By digging, by building, by testing my assumptions against reality." Maya handed back the notebook. "And maybe someday you'll teach the next person. That's how knowledge survives. By being passed down." Maya returned to her shelter that evening as the sun was setting. The structure had been expanded and improved over the years. More rooms, better systems, refinements based on 10 years of learning and testing and adapting. But it was still, fundamentally, the same shelter she had dug by hand when she was terrified and alone and desperate for a way to survive. She stood at the entrance and looked at the landscape around her. The pines were growing taller. The grass was thick and green from a wet winter. The scars from the fire were still visible if you knew where to look, but they were healing. The land was recovering in its own time, its own way. She thought about paradise burning, about running through smoke and losing everything and barely surviving, about the 5 years of fear and isolation that followed. She thought about the hole she had started digging, one shovelful at a time, building something that felt impossible but was the only thing that made sense. She thought about 71 people in the Redding shelter, about 1,600 people during the August complex fire, about 8,000 people over 10 years, all of them alive because engineering could protect what evacuation couldn't. She thought about Emma and Alicia and all the young engineers who were learning that trauma could become purpose, that fear could become action, that the answer to how do we survive this was to build systems that made survival possible. The mountains remembered the fire. They always would. But they also remembered what humans had built in response to fire. The shelters carved into hillsides, the refuges dug into the earth, the spaces where people could be safe when the world above them burned. Maya descended the stairs into her shelter, into home, and closed the door behind her. Outside, the wind was picking up. Fire season was starting again. The conditions were aligning for another bad year. But Maya wasn't afraid. She was prepared. And so were 8,000 other people across the West who had learned that survival wasn't about fighting fire or running from fire. Survival was about understanding fire, respecting it, and building systems that could withstand it. The mountains remembered, and the people who lived in those mountains had learned to remember too.